2017, and Japan has taken the video game industry by storm. With release after re-release of standout titles throughout the year, no one is safe from having fun. In the first 6 months we had Breath of the Wild, NieR, Yakuza, Persona, I think I saw a decent Dragon Ball game somewhere. And if those games don't tickle your fancy, don't worry, there's so much more where that came from. Even if you were part of the smallest niche market, there was something made for you. If you wanted great storytelling, you got it. If you wanted beautiful art, you got it. If you wanted great music, boy oh boy, I did not sit through 2017. I danced through it. And while the West has its own share of hits, we owe a lot to glorious Nippon for making this year so good. So what better way to honour these developers than to look at a game that centers around the land of the rising sun itself. Set in Sengoku period, Nioh is an action RPG hybrid with a more methodical approach to combat, where attacks demand more commitment and damage is delivered by the truckload. It features checkpoints that respawn all the enemies on the map, a currency that can be dropped on death, marks representing where other players have died, as well as mimic chests, illusionary walls, and yes, it's like Dark Souls. And while I hate that every game nowadays has an inevitable comparison to the series, it's pretty hard to avoid contrasting the two games when the developers themselves admit it. However, don't play this game expecting a Souls experience. The inspirations are worn on its sleeve, but what should be just as obvious is Team Ninja's intent on building on these foundations with their own teachings in mind. So think of a game that reflects elements from Ninja Gaiden and other action games, as well as Bloodborne and Dark Souls. It might lose what you thought made the Soulsborne series special, but in the process it manages to stand out in its own way. How does Nioh do that? Well, it does so with one of my favourite combat systems in recent memory. In the first few hours, players will be cautious and meticulous with their bouts as if they've just set foot back in the undead prison. But as you improve, you'll come to realise that the game allows for a surprising amount of aggression as long as you're skilled enough to set the pace. Let's start with the stances then. Nioh's main draw is that for each melee weapon there are 3 stances that fit a common playstyle. The high stance offers big damage attacks, mid stance is the best straight defense, while low stance is the fastest and most evasive. To accomplish this, each stance have different attacks and combos as well as properties to reinforce that style. Damage per hit and attack speed are the obvious ones, but they also change how efficiently you block as well as what dodge you use, with the choice between a slow and safe fat roll, a quick dash that requires precise timing, or a mix of both. If it's not obvious yet, sticking to preferred stance for a whole fight misses the point of this system, as the combat hinges on you deciding which stance is appropriate in the moment-to-moment clashes. Mixing low and mid stance when on the defensive, and going high to maximize your damage, it keeps the brain engaged and does wonders for your enjoyment. It also keeps all the weapon types viable for the game. Low stance offers the typically slow axes some decent mobility, as well as allowing spears to get up close and personal in the heat of the moment. And if you feel like you're not doing enough damage, figuring out a way to sneak in a couple high stance hits will solve your problems more often than not. You can already see there's a lot going on with this system without even talking about the attacks themselves. As well as basic light and heavy combos, each stance has an unlockable special attack that can be performed by pressing a face button while guarding. And these attacks are sick as hell. Quick draw attacks for the fellow weeaboos, sprinting through hordes with a flurry of blades, and being able to vault over enemies. By the way, Nioh, congrats on being the first game to make spears fun. Looking at the map for this system, each stance can have 4 different command attacks, therefore each weapon can have 12, therefore the player with a 2 weapon limit can have up to 24 attacks available at one time, 18 if you want to avoid cluttering up the dodge button. This doesn't even count the techniques performed through combos or other means. This control scheme does a lot with the limits of a gamepad, and it's implemented pretty intuitively. You don't need to memorize a couple hundred combos just to make the most out of these weapons. Now, Nioh doesn't take full advantage of this, and I can accept that as what skills are there are still a blast to use. But what I don't get is how the game forces you to choose between multiple attacks when it can easily house them all. For instance, the high stance for dual swords have 2 special attacks, Water Sword and Windstorm, but you can only bind them to one button, block triangle. And yet, with mid stance, you can tie your attacks to triangle, square, and the X button. The mid stance itself has too many attacks tied to it, 5 command attacks in total, with 3 being parries and 1 other attack that seems more fitting for low stance, which in the base game had no command attacks. It feels completely arbitrary that attacks have to compete just to be a part of your moveset. Wouldn't the game be more interesting if that decision making was done in the moment-to-moment gameplay? Like those 3 parries I mentioned before, they vary in risk and reward, so letting the player make judgments on what parry they think they can get away with would achieve the same goal the stat system itself accomplishes. I'm not sure what the reasoning was behind this. As far as I can tell, it's not a balancing issue, because all these techniques are still bound by the game's key system. Speaking of which, in Nioh, ki is mumbo jumbo for stamina, and it works just as you'd expect from an action RPG, but with a few additional mechanics it becomes much more integral to the action side, as well as neatly tying itself to other mechanics and systems. In Dark Souls, combat is slow and expensive. With attacks normally taking a large chunk of your health bar, players will naturally choose to react to enemy attacks and pace themselves based on said enemies, leading to a more passive and defensive playstyle with a lot of downtime. Bloodborne addressed this by throwing away shields, but also through its rally mechanic. It doesn't matter if you get hit, as long as you're trading blows, you'll get some health back. Therefore, all-out aggression doesn't cost as much as it did before, and becomes much more viable. In Nioh's case, it tackles this in its own way through the stamina system. Because it wasn't convenient enough that William had a magical book teaching him the martial arts, it also seems he found a copy of Gears of War on the boat to Japan. After finishing a string of attacks, you have the opportunity to perform an active reload and refund that lost stamina with a key pulse, requiring a well-timed press of the right bumper. This allows for extremely aggressive playstyles that reward skill by loosening the restrictions the stamina system would normally enforce. With all that potential stamina to regain, players can go on large offensives and still be capable of defending themselves when the ghoulies start hitting back. And it's still risky as the timing for a key pulse and the timing to safely react to an attack won't always align with each other. And what's this? The button used for key pulses is the same button used to switch stances and weapons? I wonder if that means anything. Well, what do you know? If you change stances after performing a key pulse, you can regain even more stamina, as if there weren't enough reasons to change stances regularly. But wait, there's more. Switching weapons after a key pulse lets you lead off with an extra attack, encouraging use of both weapons. Sheathing your sword on a pulse lets you perform a quick draw faster, letting you be stylish more often, and changing stances with a spear gives you a quick attack, promoting a constant mix-up of stances. All these minor mechanics make Ki not just a good system on its own, but a great incentive for players to learn more about the tools at their disposal. To top it all off, as you absorb more and more soul stones, also known as Amaretta, you'll be able to temporarily fuse your guardian spirit to your blade, forming a living weapon. It offers a gigantic boost to your damage output, as well as afflicting your spirit's status ailment. The closest comparison to this would probably be Devil Trigger from the DMC games, but where its time limit was based on one element, Living Weapon's time limit is based on a combination of 3 resources: your health, ki, and Amaretta. Absorbing Amaretta from dead enemies extends the time in Living Weapon, but taking damage, health or ki-wise, will take massive chunks out of your timer. It is extremely powerful, maybe too powerful, but the biggest offset to this is that it's awfully fragile. With all those ways to lose meter, it's just as likely for you to decimate a boss in a few seconds as he is to smack you out of that form in the same amount of time, leaving you ready to be wombo comboed. Because of this, it can come off as pretty unwieldy at first, as with no additional protection, you could be killed immediately after Living Weapon ends. From my experience, this mode is more appropriate for killing lots of trash, as the constant stream of Amaretta keeps it active, yet I doubt anyone needs help killing a couple bandits and a spoopy skeleton. Meanwhile, the big bad bosses are the most inappropriate times to trigger it. Imagine going into the boss room, having a quick duel, popping it off in the middle, and at some point you still die. Well, now that spirit is stuck in the boss room. Unless you want to sacrifice your hard-earned spirit stones, you won't get another opportunity to recharge Living Weapon until the boss is dead. So you've only got one shot to do good with a Living Weapon. And you know what gamers do with a single-use item? We never fucking use it. Especially if there's a chance that we wasted it. As it is, Living Weapon is in an awkward spot for me. On the one hand, it can be so strong that I feel like I'm cheating some of these fights. On the other hand, it's so easy to lose that I had trouble getting comfortable with the mechanic. I'm sure a lot of players will still find it useful as a way to even the odds, and if that's not enough, you could always break the game with magic and booby traps. When it comes to upgrading abilities, you have the choice between weapon skills, Omyo Magic, and ninjutsus. Each come with their own set of points that are earned either by investing in certain stats or finding locks of hair belonging to samurai, mages, and ninjas. Regardless of the build, you will always have a decent amount of points in both magic and ninjutsus, the only catch being that gaining access to the more powerful spells and tricks requires you to invest in dexterity and magic stats. Once unlocked though, you can revert back to your original stats and they will still be available. Most of the techniques on offer are used for buffs, debuffs and status ailments, with magic focusing on elemental power and range attacks, while ninjutsu apply paralysis and poison through your weapons as well as traps. There are also a couple more unique powers like summoning a guardian spirit and the ability to backstab enemies, but only when they're not aware of you, so it's not abusable, which I can't say for some of the other spells. There's a lot of abilities I would consider cheese. Buffing your attack or reducing a boss's defense and slowing them to a snail's pace practically cripples every enemy in the game, and quick change scrolls literally give you extra lives. I would not recommend some of these spells for your first playthrough, and maybe these are the words of a masochist, but I don't think you'll derive as much enjoyment from these fights if you treat them the same way a construction worker treats a pile of gravel. So this game's given us a lot to work with and a lot to think about. Sounds like you can get a good tango going with one of our dance partners. The supernatural opponents of Nioh are inspired by Japanese legends and folklore. So you've got your tanukis, your tengus, your kappas, your wheel skeletons. They're all pretty fun, and with a few exceptions, they all test you on the core tenets of the combat system, like how some enemies have weak spots on their heads which can only be hit by vertical swipes, reminding you that high sense is useful even if it doesn't seem immediately obvious. But the best thing about these fiendish foes is that they play by the same rules you do. That's right, you're not the only one with a state-of-the-art asthma inhaler. Enemies also abide by the laws of stamina, with a few differences between humans and yokai. The ghouls and goblins can't regenerate stamina unless they're sitting in a portal to the yokai realm, and once stamina is depleted, they will flinch at your attacks, allowing you to release all that pent-up anger with a massive combo. The yokai portals not only serve as a way for foes to regain stamina, but also allow them to control space, as they also prevent you from gaining ki. The player has to perform a perfect ki pulse near them to banish it, which might be tricky for the player to do depending on the situation. Some bosses make great use of this, creating portals here, there and everywhere, adding an extra layer of arena management in the midst of a challenging fight. But when you're fighting humans, it's a different beast entirely. Their attacks cost stamina, but they can regenerate it. They can take hit stun, for the most part, and if you get them out of breath, they're left open to a powerful grapple attack, or worse. Where yokai could be approached as a war of attrition, the humans regenerating stamina demands that you find opportunities to counterattack, and then decide whether it's worth following up on your assault as you try to figure out which one of you run out of ki first. But while these samurai are definitely fun to clash with, there are a few occurring issues with a couple enemy types. First off, damage dealt on contact with an enemy should be treated very carefully in anything with close quarters combat, because this is an attack that's delivered without any form of wind-up or telegraphing. These two aren't mutually exclusive though. There are games like Hollow Knight and many others that pull it off, but that's also a 2D platformer where you can easily gauge distances at any point in a fight. Now I do still like these lost souls, as they're really frail and the little buffs they give make them come off more as an extension of the level design. But dying just because a whale monk decided to have a leisurely stroll is infuriating. What also grinds my gears are the enemies that can slow you down with either a lightning element or their gift wrapping. And I just find that such a boring way of punishing the player. Meanwhile, being able to perform a stop, drop and roll to get rid of burns can add a little more fun to the fight, because now when the player finds a breathing room, they have to decide what's more worthwhile: do some damage, heal up, or get rid of the burn. Whereas fire is avoidable and weak, there is some damage that is arguably inescapable and lethal. When a yokai is sick of your shit, they might throw out an ink-coloured hand to snatch you up and finish the fight in one shot. Some of these attacks push the boundary of what I would consider fair. For instance, this little piggy has a grab that takes 26 frames to snatch me from the point his hand started glowing, which means it had a wind up of 0.43 seconds. Now the average human reaction time to visual stimuli is around 1/4 of a second. It sounds okay, but the test used to collect this statistic is extremely simple. It only has one stimuli and one response. Left click on the mouse as soon as the screen turns green. Now imagine if the screen could change to multiple colours, some of which had you left click, some of which had you right click, and some you could do either. According to Higgs's law, your reaction time would suffer greatly because of it. So in the context of fighting an enemy with several different attacks with multiple defensive options, a grab that you have to recognize and then dodge within half a second seems a bit more imbalanced. In some cases, enemies deal with this by telegraphing their behaviour well before they even attack. This guy likes to do a roll towards you before going in for a headbutt. He can still grab you without rolling, but the immediate solution is to never spend too much time close to him. Other enemies actually have reasonably timed grabs, but when a bullshit grab lands, it's really hard to let it slide, because the absurd amount of damage they do. So, they aren't perfect, but there are some qualities of the foes that I like, such as their tendency to mix up attacks. Instead of sticking to one attack at a time or a couple distinct combos, certain yokai and bosses can use different attacks within a combo or outright finish them early. Take this Licky Tongue for example. This slimy bugger likes to attack using a mix of martial arts and tongue lashings. His basic pattern begins with a force palm followed by a lick. He could also throw out a second force palm to end the combo early, or he could start with 2 licks in a row. This isn't even mentioning that after a click attack, there's a chance that he'll immediately follow up with a Giga Impact, extending the combo a little more. There's also a fake out clap that can initiate combos, a grab, a series of arm thrusts, as well as just being able to use any of these attacks on their own. Add them all together, and with just 10 attacks, you've got about double the outcomes. Probably a bit more. I don't think I got everything recorded. I may have just explained the obvious to you guys, but this simple difference does a lot for these enemies. It means players can't always perceive the outcome just from the first attack. They have to pay attention to the whole combo and figure out when they can or can't retaliate. It makes the enemy AI appear a bit smarter because they won't always waste time fighting thin air. The player has to stay within an uncomfortable distance to bait out the more exposing moves. It also helps with the bosses because when they enter a new phase, as well as gaining more flashy attacks and mechanics, attacks that were previously punishable get extended to trip up players. This can go a bit too far though. Enemies like the Namahage can be pretty hard to get a grip of when it looks like they're just constantly flailing their weapons to no end, and certain bosses can just go on and on without stopping. But it does more without having to spend time and money on new attacks, and it helps keep enemies fresh, even when you're fighting one for the 100th time. And in this case, that's pretty important. So looking at all the enemies in the game, counting the variations with meaningful changes, and discounting those who are just palette swaps, there's about 21 different yokai enemies and 5 tiers of humans, giving you 26 enemy types for the base game. Now compare that to Dark Souls, which is near the triple digits range, and this can appear to be inexcusable, but I think it's worth noting Nioh's standards for enemy variety is much closer to an action game than an RPG. Whereas Dark Souls has a completely new set of enemies for each area with a couple recurring faces, Nioh has a roster of regular fiends that is gradually expanded upon over the course of the game, returning in more difficult enemy competitions. It's still hard to forgive as the game is much longer than a standard action game, and most of the enemy types are revealed by the time we reach the 3rd region. But to be honest, this roster never got repetitive for me. Will this be a problem for you? Hard to say, but if you're experienced in hack and slashes like DMC or any of Cloudham's work, you'll probably be more comfortable with it despite how noticeable an issue it is. But let's stop picking on the little guys. What about that lineup of heavy hitters? There's about 24 bosses in the base game, with a few optional duels scattered around the campaign. Out of that 24, there were only 3 I thought were outright bad. One was a puzzle fight, one was a stat gate, and the other was just plain inconsistent to hit. That leaves around 2100 bosses that vary between decent, but not memorable, and fan-fucking-tastic. And with some great designs to boot, even though they may fall into the patterns of humans, 2-legged monsters and beasts, you've got devils like the Ogress, who looks and moves more like a marionette than a monster. And just like the cannon fodder, these enemies' use of ki is integral to the fight. There are several ways to pace a battle. Using multiple phases and different enemy states help avoid a sense of monotony and implies that the player is making progress. The key system adds this by setting up a natural sense of back and forth, as the player and enemy take the offensive at different intervals, and the big intimidating health bars can be broken down into several smaller key bars as a way to measure your progress. The human enemies also have access to their own living weapon forms, which gives them new attacks, makes them immune to parries, and stops them from taking hit stun at the price of being unable to regenerate stamina. But these fights are also a test of your stamina management too. Some bosses can be so aggressive that by the time they show an opportunity to hit back, you won't have the ki to make a decent dent in their health. So it's important to learn your ki pulse timings and figure out the best way to approach each boss's moveset. And these movesets have a lot of thought put in them, with a great variety of attacks to smack you senseless. For example, there's the optional fight with the Warrior of the West, which was my first big hurdle of the game, with a variety of quick draw attacks that were similar but not identical to startup. Some of them can't be blocked, while those that can will eat up a lot of your ki, stopping you from hitting back. So your first step to beating him will be learning to time a dodge through his lightning fast attacks. Blocking isn't useless here though, as he also has a ranged attack where he fires 3 arrows at once. These arrows are spaced so that if you try to dodge to the left or right, there's a good chance you'll still be hit. Once you make some decent progress into the fight, the boss can then temporarily summon his inner good boy to take a couple lunges at you. The dog acts independently from the boss, so the attacks have the chance of overlapping, and you'll have to divide your attention between the two threats. This makes for one of the better duels in the game, and don't you worry, there is more where that came from. Several of these bosses will test your ability to manage ki, as well as make use of each stance's skills and perks. Oh, so you want to know this guy's name? Well, that's easy. It's... hold on. Ah yes, Tachibana Muneshi. Okay, so as much as I love these bosses mechanically, they don't have much of a thematic presence. By which I mean the story, the music, and the cinematics just don't pull their weight. Most of these bosses don't have their own theme, and have to pick from a small handful of songs. The soundtrack itself rarely manages to hold my attention. As for the story, I want to jump into that later, but I'll tell you now that a lot of these bosses just come out of nowhere and disappear from the plot just as quickly. Meanwhile, we got Yakuza 0. In this game, you have to beat up an old man 5 times, and you know what? It works! Because this cutscene is beautiful, the music is amazing, and we're learning more about these characters and their motivations at every kick and punch. Great music and cutscenes can take a game pretty far, just ask for Vengeance, or Devil May Cry. But in spite of this, Nioh's bosses were definitely the highlight of the game for me. Some of them died a bit too quickly, but that might be because of the gear I was using. Because who needs skill when you have numbers on your side? Okay, I love action games, and I enjoy RPGs, but when I see floating damage numbers in my beat'em-ups, that sets off alarm bells. Because for me, it only adds tedium and frustration with little to no benefit. For instance, in Darksiders 2, if you check out this outpost on your way to the first dungeon, you can find an optional boss who will promptly one-shot you. Turns out you're meant to find him later on with some decent gear, so of course it's my fault for daring to explore in an open world game. It also features a skill tree where you choose between playing a fighter or a mage, but not both unless you want to lose out on a lot of potential damage. And every half an hour you're going to have to sit down and sift through your inventory and find out which one of the 100th signs you picked up are worth keeping. If it isn't obvious yet, I prefer the first game. And these problems are pretty common with action games that opt for Diablo-style loot drops. And for what? Just to add pointless, unsatisfying number crunching to the game. Equipping the same weapon but with bigger numbers just so they scale with the enemies is not what I call good feedback. An extra 10 points of damage won't change how I play. This isn't even going on how the difficulty curve in these games can go all over the place. If you're not careful, you can break the difficulty of some of these fights. If you do things too early, you'll risk being underpowered, enemies start staying their welcome, and the margin for error becomes so small that you've barely learned anything about the encounter before you're cursing at the TV. But if I stop and grind for too long, I just bulldoze through the fights without learning to appreciate them, without having to figure out the timings and the nuances of the combat. The idea of these leveling systems is that each player can find their own sweet spot in between. In some cases this can work, but more often than not we end up flipping from one extreme to the other, with the player spending way too much time and effort trying to find the ideal way to play the game, when they could just be playing the game. But enough with my whinging. How does it impact Nioh? Well, the mission-based approach to levels doesn't hamper my sense of exploration. While you are restricted to 2 weapons and your choice of armor is limited by your build, pretty much everything is viable on the first playthrough, and respeccing your stance is easy to do with an item that's pretty cheap. In terms of difficulty, I was cruising through the levels without much of a hiccup, while also doing none of the side missions, as I heard you'd end up too strong with the campaign. If you're having trouble with a certain area and don't share my aversion to cheese, you've got several options to bypass enemies using magic, ninjutsus, living weapon, or just grinding. There are a couple instances though where I thought the RPG systems could damage the moment. For instance, there's a boss in the DLC called Maria of the Astral Outhouse, which is widely known amongst Nioh players as one of the hardest bosses in the game. This is because her moveset has very few openings, a quick grab just like our spear friend, and in her second phase she gains all the benefits of a yokai but still has regenerating ki. The only option was to whittle her health down through some quick jabs, which I thought was fine, because in my first fight with Maria, she was a glass cannon, leading to a human duel where I was more on the defensive than usual. But if someone else walked into this fight too early, we dive straight back into that murky area where the battles take too long to win and too short to lose. Meanwhile, we've got the Yuki-onna, which was a phenomenal fight. That ends way too soon. But the biggest problem Nioh couldn't get away from is the tedium. Loot practically rains from the sky, leaving you with a lot of trash to sift through. Each piece of gear comes with a bunch of secondary effects like extra life, more damage, and... the fuck is this? The rate that you'd find equipment was counterbalanced by a durability mechanic in the alpha, but feedback quickly demanded it be drawn and quartered. Don't worry though, on your first playthrough, you will never have to worry about your gear. You can completely ignore the blacksmith and the 100 things you can do with it, as long as you equip whatever has the biggest number at the time. The only thing you should keep an eye out for is weight and agility. The difficulty curve will never break, although it did feel a little too easy when I did the submissions. Also, customizing your appearance is quick and easy. You can refashion your equipment to look like any piece of gear that you've seen, meaning you don't need to keep a separate piece of gear for cosmetics, you just have to pick one up once. You can also purchase transformations from the tea house to cosplay as other characters, including the waifus. So Nioh's RPG mechanics aren't dreadful, though I don't think it adds more than the tedium aside from one or two exceptions. If I could choose, I would rather take Dark Souls' more simple approach to this. One version of each weapon and armor set, a lot less RNG involved, and they're all technically viable as long as they're upgraded and supported by an appropriate build. But we're stuck with a lot of worthless micromanagement and stats that only mean much in the long haul. It's tolerable, I guess. But after the first playthrough you're gonna have to start looking into this fog of statistics just to make sure enemies will still two-shot you instead of one-shot you. The levels in Nioh do a good job at emulating the basics of a Soulsborne, small maps that are incredibly dense with shortcuts looping back on themselves. They're not interconnected with each other, but considering the premise of the game, it wouldn't be very believable to pretend these historical locations are just a hop, skip and fat roll away. Other than that, they seem to fall into the same trap as the bosses do, where, regrettably, none of these missions really stood out to me. Now I can't say they're bad, as when I think about it, they do vary things level by level. Some missions focus more on fighting humans or yokai. Others focus on specific mechanics like mazes of fire, poisonous caves, and the strongest enemy in the game, these fucking crystals and their regenerating health. There's also just some good design in the levels themselves. Like in the second mission, there's a house on top of the hill with 4 or 5 enemies guarding the gate. Now if you're a badass, you can attempt to brute force your way through them, or if you opt for the longer route, you could take pot shots at them from a nearby cliff, climb down, and then catch them off guard from behind. Even the levels I remember thinking were bland were well put together. I guess it's just that eventually these levels boil down to 2 types of encounters. A straight up fight, or an obvious ambush. Obvious in the sense that every enemy with a bow and arrow might as well have a neon sign strapped to them. Maybe this is an inherent problem for action games, as usually the best arenas for fights are the empty ones, but in the end, very few levels stand out to me on their own merits. It doesn't help when the submissions recycle settings, concepts and enemies to hell and back, but I will say there are some interesting elements on display. Illusionary walls, mimics and bloodstains return, but with new bells and whistles to make them fresh. The walls have eyes, and big strong arms to swat you with. If you're paying attention, you can slip past them without a fight, but a misplaced swing here and there and you might get more than you bargained for. If you're interested in mirror matches, you'll be happy to know that the mimics can imitate you just as well as imitating chests. And now, you can summon revenants from dead players' bloodstains, allowing you to swipe their gear and earn some glory, which you should start farming immediately so you can dress up as your favourite characters that make up this lackluster story. The plot ultimately serves as a grand trip around Samurai Land, and it's a nice time. The scenery is gorgeous, the locals are a joy to be around, it had a lovely petting zoo. There was a lot of useless crap in the souvenir shop, but my biggest problem was the tour guide himself. Will.i.am Adams is based off a real-life figure. He has his own motivations, a backstory, and is fully voiced, a departure from the nameless and silent schmucks of Lordran. And yet, he's treated like a silent protagonist. There are several cutscenes where he doesn't say a word, and even when he does, it barely qualifies as dialogue. People talk at William with lines that don't have any sense of back and forth, and while the plot will feign his development, there is nothing to attach me to this protagonist. But William is a symptom of an even greater problem, because what we got here is a game with half a story, which is even worse than having no story. A majority of the cutscenes only last long enough to push a bare-bones plot forward, with the supporting cast getting most of their characterization through their backstories, retold by the guardian spirits in these animated vignettes. It's very nice and pretty, but a good backstory alone isn't enough to make these characters memorable, so when the game tries to pull at my heartstrings in the more emotional moments, it falls flat on its face. The setting itself of a country in civil war was pretty hard to keep track of. Maybe the devs just expected this period to be common knowledge. Some of these historical figures are pretty popular in Japan, but it was a common occurrence for me to mix up names and jump into missions with no context at all, seeing as how most of it was explained through throwaway text. Some levels don't even get an introductory cutscene, and even if they do, all it does is say, "Look, there's Willie, doing what he always does." Absolutely nothing. For example, in this mission we are tasked by this beautiful woman to find her husband. But did you know that these guys are actually loyal to the villains? Yeah, this rescue was supposed to be an attempt at negotiating with the Tachibana clan to side with us, because at this point of the story, the two warring factions are still building their armies and making allies before all hell breaks loose. Wow, doesn't this sound really interesting? It's a shame that it goes completely over our heads. The only real positive I can give the story is that all the female characters have some great designs without showing too much skin. And that's shocking to see from Team Ninja, devs famous for their insightful use of physics. At the end of the day, the biggest fault of this story is that it's dry and boring, which is the worst thing it can be. At least a bad story can still leave an impression, and a game with little to no story can surround you with mystery. And that is a damn shame, because Nioh has the meat to keep people interested, but there's no hook. So much as I can gush about these mechanics and the fights, it's not hard to see why people forgot about this game. But this wouldn't be a proper Dark Souls ripoff if it didn't come with some quality DLC. For the price of £20, you can download 3 extra campaigns: Dragon of the North, Defiant Honor, and Bloodshed's End. Each expansion comes with new missions, new enemies, new weapons, and new bosses, who are all pretty much on par, if not even better than the base game's bosses. My personal favourite is a toss-up between Date Shikazane and Sanada Yukimura. Shikazane has this amazing design, where he's a hybrid of a human and a centipede with several swords embedded into his back, and keeping true to this design, he can toss those swords at you and strike from a variety of ranges, making him tricky to reposition around. My favourite attack is this extensive flailing combo he does that covers a lot of ground. It's easy to keep away from until he has you cornered, or you'll have to learn to dodge each swipe. Sanada was just demanding. I was surprised to find another big hill so late in the game. He practically spends the entire fight in a living weapon, and when he's not, it's only for a few seconds before the spirit kicks back in. Add to that he's pretty quick and has the means to get in your face, and I had to learn to be so much more aggressive than I usually am. Even the joke boss was a blast. There's this little shit who rattles on about honor, but plays like the cheesiest NPC I've ever faced, not counting the firing squads behind you if you weren't being thorough. The new levels are pretty nice, with the Siege of Osaka being one of the better stages in the game. We've also got some new weapons, the Odachi and the Tonfas, as well as new moves for existing weapons, and they're a joy to use, with the big butter knives allowing you to switch stances mid-combos, while the Tonfas allow your key pulses to double as a free dodge. The extra challenge comes in the form of New Game Plus modes. At first you'll be finding through Way of the Samurai, then on your second playthrough Way of the Strong, and then through the DLC, Way of the Demon, Way of the Wise, and Way of the Nioh. I'm a bit torn on this. On the one hand, a campaign with all the new adversaries mixed in sounds like the perfect remedy to the game's enemy variety issues, but to reach that point, you have to beat the game 4 times, and after my third playthrough, the new content was spread way too thin. The biggest alterations to the new difficulty modes revolve around gear, including new tiers of loot and enemies with a red tint and a whole lot of buffs. Now sure, the bad guys hit harder, but I don't find that approach to difficulty on its own enjoyable, and now I can't ignore the blacksmith or the other RPG systems. I have to start investing in gear, grind for crafting resources and recipes, figure out what all these stats mean, and spend half an hour respecing my stats and skills, and... Can I just hit people? Please? Ultimately, there is only one reason to play Nioh: the swordplay. Everything else either underperforms or is just set dressing. Compare it to its peers who excel in other areas but also manage to be more well-rounded, and you can get why the game has faded in the public's perception. But you know what? This is my game of the year, because this was my niche. This game scratched an itch that I thought only a new Devil May Cry could solve. When I think about my favourite moments of the year, it was the joy and sheer satisfaction of triumph as I finally cut down these legendary foes that cost me hours that I do not regret spending. Sure, you could argue that several other games are more deserving of that spot, and you wouldn't be wrong. In fact, that's the best part. 2017 has been amazing, and when it came to those obligatory top 10 lists at the end of the year, people had no issues filling them out, but instead more trouble figuring out what had to be kicked out. Because everyone had something to love. Games can reach you on many levels, including sound, story, or visuals, and 2017 has proven that in every regard. But for me, the fastest way to a gamer's heart is through gameplay. And the most gratifying form of gameplay is sheathing and unsheathing katanas in an overly dramatic fashion. To me, combat is king, and Nioh wears that crown well.